the state's budget for the next 2 years, plus the reaction to Governor Evers' use of a line item veto powers. CBS 58's Emily Fannin, WisPolitics editor J.R. Ross discuss in tonight's Capitol Connection.
We got our full budget recap now that Governor Evers issued 51 partial vetoes before signing the $98.7 billion spending plan for the state, which lawmakers sent him last week. There's a lot of headlines that came out of this, JR. First, let's start just talking about some of the big ones with his partial veto pen that he made. One is that Evers raised revenue limits for public school districts by $325 per student for the next 402 years. That's correct, for the next 4 centuries. He also cut income taxes by $175 million over the next 2 years, which is a fraction of what GOP lawmakers proposed in the budget. He also was able to retain 188 positions at the UW campuses that work on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Also just want to kind of recap really quick what remained in the budget. $32 million cuts for the UW system for diversity efforts, $125 million to combat PFAS, $1 billion for public schools, and pay raises for state employees, correctional officers, and assistant district attorneys. That's why the governor said, I'm going to sign this budget because these are kind of my key priorities that I've rallied for ever since getting into office. But ones that are kind of making headways, let's first just start with tax cuts, because this will now dramatically change of what Republicans originally proposed. They say the average would be roughly around $573 tax cuts for most taxpayers. Now under Evers with his veto, it's now roughly about $36. So that's kind of the big argument right now between Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, and there's always a look at it too. I mean, the average income tax cut under the GOP plan skewed for the wealthy. I mean, if you make more than $1 million, more than $30,000 bucks, $500,000, $1 million, around $6,000 or so. So it really kind of skewed toward top earners, which Republicans argue keep things more competitive. One thing to remember about this whole tax cut thing, all right? Because of Evers' veto, the money stays in the general fund. Doing some back of the napkin math, we're talking like we are looking at maybe a $3.5 billion surplus in this biennium, barring a recession or further action on taxes or spending by this legislature and Governor Evers. They could come together in the fall, for example, and strike a deal. You know, say, hey, let's do a different tax cut, Governor. We'll give you a couple things you want. You give us this, and we'll walk away happy. Or in 2 years, again, barring recession, we have the exact same conversation. Do we do more tax cuts or more spending on schools going forward? Now, the governor's veto, again, with those the revenue limits, it doesn't mean property tax increases for sure. It doesn't mean for sure a spending increase, because they can change that law at any time. But if it remains in place, you do have to pump more money in to that formula to keep down the impact on property taxes.
And keeping on that topic of the school aid veto, it reached almost national headlines because many people were surprised, even Wisconsinites, of just how broad the governor's veto powers are. Yes, there have been Democratic and Republican governors that have done similar actions before, but now looking ahead to next week, the big question mark is, will there be a lawsuit? There's kind of these 3 avenues going forward. Do the courts settle this over veto powers? Does the legislature come back and act on it, which is a little unlikely, given Evers is still in power, or do we see lawmakers present a constitutional amendment to change this going forward?
And if it goes to the courts, we have a great roadmap what the courts might do with these vetoes. So Scott Walker in 2017 created a 1,001-year veto. There's this exception to school revenue limits for these various projects. Lawmakers wanted a 1-year moratorium. He struck out a couple of numbers, like what Evers did, made it a 1,001-year break for that tax break, or that exemption. The courts looked at that action and said, okay, look, this lawsuit was filed a challenge. It was filed in October of 2019. It was too late to take up that case. They never talked about the merits of what Walker did. Rebecca Bradley, conservative justice, did say she thought it exceeded the limits of the governor's powers, but she was one justice at the time who's still on the court come this summer. 2, the court that same day overturned 3 of Evers' partial vetoes from the 2017 budget, or 19 budget, I'm sorry. The problem is, those justices have a solid standard that went across all of the vetoes of why it should be struck down. So the court is changing from a conservative majority to a liberal one, and we don't have a clear standard. So if there's a lawsuit, which probably is going to happen, I can't tell you what the court might do because they haven't given us good signs so far of how they might act.
And the timeline, too, is important, as we mentioned before, because incoming liberal Justice Janet Protasiewicz will be taking the bench on August 1st. All right, that will do it for this week's show. Thanks so much for joining us.
The lawsuit